So about a week or 10 days ago, I got a call from an investor who I've known for years. She's done well as a wholesaler. And she called me and said, how much is your transactional funding on $800,000? So I said, it's 0.75% plus $50 wire fee, so it'd be $6,050. And she said, okay, great. I have a deal. It's fabulous. She told me where it was, and I said to myself, wow, pretty good. She said, and it's got 2 lots. Now, the lots in this community sell for $1 million. Waterfront, intercoastal access, no fixed bridges, all the right kind of things. So I didn't hear from her. And then suddenly I get a phone call, and she says, I have a need for double closing tomorrow. I said, well, okay, what's going on? She said, well, the 80-year-old gentleman that I'm buying the property from has been an investor before, and I sort of led him to believe that I was going to buy the property, hold it, and live in it. I said, okay, what are you going to do with it? She said, I already have it sold. I said, what'd you pay for it? She said, I paid $800,000 and I sold it for $1.6 million. I said, okay, well, what's the problem? She said, well, I went to the closing agent today to sign the documents. As you've always said, don't be there for the closing. But I have a guru. I actually paid for a mentoring program by a national guy. I said, great, I hope that's working for you. She said, well, he told me to assign it. For an $800,000 profit, he told you to assign it. She said, yeah. He told me to tell the closing agent exactly how to prepare the A to B, what would have been an A to B HUD, and what would have been a B to C HUD, because now it's an A to C. You're actually using the end buyer's money to purchase the property, which is not illegal in the state that she was in. So I said, okay, what happened? Do me a personal favor. Give me a like down below and share, and most importantly, subscribe, because I have a lot of great information that will help you get more deals and help you make more money on the deals that you get. She said, well, I saw the preliminary A to B, so to speak. I'll tell you what it was. What he does is, and agents do this, they prepare half a HUD, and they give the buyer half to the buyer, and they give the seller half to the seller. And all is well, except when the seller sees that his sale price is $1.6 million. That could be a problem. But this agent was smart enough to know that she would put $800,000 on there, and it would appear to be that he was getting proceeds from an $800,000 purchase. All's well and good. The end buyer's half of the HUD also showed $1.6 million, so he's paying $1.6. All's well in paradise. Except that on the first side with the seller, where it said buyer, it was blank. You have to do that because you can't put down the investor. Investor's not the buyer. Now you've created a fraud in writing. Up till then, you've lied to the seller and so on, but here now you've got a hard case of fraud, and the seller could very easily come back. So I went on and I said, well, what's the problem? She said, well, the seller has seen the preliminary HUD, his half, and he said to me, why is your name not on here as the buyer? And she fumbled and mumbled around, blamed it on the closing agent. Of course, what he did is he called the closing agent, and the closing agent said, I can't put her name as the buyer because she's not the buyer. He said, well, what are you talking about? Who is the buyer? And he said, John Smith. And he said, well, wait a minute. What's John Smith got to do with this? And of course, the closing agent said, well, she's assigning the contract to John Smith. And the sellers got really pretty angry because very oftentimes sellers will work with you to take a lower price because they like you. Other investors will come along and offer more money, and they just don't like the delivery or whatever else was going on for the other investor. And they take a lower price. Now, if you tell them you're going to live in the property and you love it and all that, your chances probably are even better. They're going to sell to you versus another investor who comes in, complains about all the work he has to do, and talks about renting it and all the kinds of things that a homeowner that's lived there a long time doesn't really want to hear. In this case, she's saying to me, can you double close it tomorrow? And I said, yeah, I can double close it, but it may be too late. And it turns out it was too late. The seller found out. She called me back and she said, what can I do now? And I said, you can't do anything. You'd be very lucky if you aren't sued by the seller for a deceptive business practice. Now, he'll call it fraud in our state. It's called deceptive business practice, and it's actually a misdemeanor, But if he goes before a judge, you sue him for breach, judge is going to be on his side. So you messed it up. Now I said, what happened that you decided not to double close it? So he would have seen you as a buyer, you would have been the buyer, and then half an hour, hour later, you would have been the seller, and so on and so forth. He said, well, I tried to save some money. And I said, my fee was $6,050. How much were you trying to save? And she said, well, I was trying to save the double closing costs. How much were those? I said, do you know how much they were? And she said, yeah, they were roughly $7,000 on one side, about $6,800 on the other side. So for the sake of $6,000 and $64,000 and $7,000, whatever that comes out to be, she lost an $800,000 profit, less those closing costs. Talked about this before, penny wise and pound foolish. Oftentimes I see investors try to save that double closing cost instead of asking the seller or the end buyer to pay for it because you've taken a smaller amount or paid more than you wanted to on the seller side. They just default to, I'm going to assign it. And what happens is that the contracts they have say assignment across the top of the contract. And they use the words and or assigns as the buyer, which are deal killers. The and or assigns hasn't been used by the people that are in the know, sophisticated investors probably for 20 years. But again, everybody says that. Just use and or assigns and then at the closing change it and so on and so forth. Well, the title policy is going to be issued in the original buyer's name, which is the way it was sent to the title insurer. So it has to be reworked. It's not as easy as just change it at the closing. It can be done. What's happening here is now suddenly you have an A to C instead of a double closing. Look, I am a transactional funder. I'm not telling you this because I want your transactional funding. I'm telling you that if you can assign it and you're sure that the seller and the buyer don't object when they see it, then do them all. Do every one of them that way. I talked to somebody the other day who had done 200, and I said to him, congratulations, I signed every one of them. I said, great. So how much do you make on average? He said, well, I make $13,000 on average. I'm just saying to you, if you're used to $1,500 or $5,000 and an assignment sounds like $13,000 is really pretty good, you're not in the ballpark. You're not making the serious profits that you need to really make this into a career buster. I also said to him, what are your acquisition costs per closing? He said, they're right around $3,000. So, wait a minute. So you're not making $13,000 profit. You're making 13 less 3 or $10,000. He said, yeah, and I do have another cost. And I said, what's that? He said, well, I have a disposition person that I pay 50% of the spread to. So on the $13,000 profit on all of those properties, on average, he netted $5,000 each, which on 200 properties is $1 million. But his person who sold them for him equally made $1 million. And I said to him, why don't you do this yourself? He said, I don't like talking to people. I said, well, is it worth $1 million to not talk to people? You can hire a lot of people to sell those properties for you. He said, well, yeah, you're probably right. I should think about that. Look, very oftentimes when I speak to successful investors who are doing their thing and they're doing volume, they're extremely proud of how much volume they do. Hey, I'm happy. That's what we're here for. What they don't talk about is they probably are netting less than they were 3 or 4 years before when they were doing it themselves with 1 or 2 other people at the most. What's the point of this? The point of it is, even though a seller may say to you, I don't care how much money you make, you deserve it, I love you, and I want you to make the money. And you go to your end buyer, and the end buyer says, man, this is the greatest deal I've ever had in my life. And I don't care if you're making money on it, so you assign the contract. And then the seller and the end buyer may well find out at closing that you've just made $800,000 or $80,000, or in some cases as little as $8,000, where they've objected to you making too much money. If people say to me, well, how much is too much? It's in the eyes of the beholder. The seller may think, I really don't want to pay a 3% commission to an agent, so I don't want you to make more than 3%. You ought to make 1% or so. Oh, yeah, that'll work. The end buyer, he's going to be a professional in most cases, whether he's a rehabber or another wholesaler just re-wholesaling it. He's going to want to get the least he can get. And most often, the more professional they are, the more deals they've done, they have an expectation they're not going to close at the price they gave you. So be ready. I'm just telling you. How do you be ready? You have a strong buyer's list and you take backup contracts. You keep everybody in the loop and you say to them, I think my end buyer may not be able to get financing as he promised me. Are you ready to close on Friday if he can't do it? And that's what you do. So I'm David Inkle, and I wish you limitless success in all that you do. Do me a personal favor. Give me a like down below and share, and most importantly, subscribe.